Okay, this is WIMBA lesson 3 and 4, and this is for help with lessons 3 and 4 in MUSI 1301 music reading. These two lessons have to do with rhythmic notation and counting that notation. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of go through some of the basics that you should know in order to notate rhythms, and you will need to be doing that as you do these assignments. The first thing we're going to talk about is note symbols. These are the symbols of the notes relative to what duration, how long these notes are lasting. Before, when we just, in the other previous lessons, when we just named pitches, then most of the time we put a whole note there just to indicate where the pitch was. But now we want to get a little more complicated, and we're going to be also indicating rhythmic values or duration values as well as the pitches. So this chart indicates the relative duration of the pitches, and it kind of lays it out mathematically. All of this is very mathematical. Most people that do well in math classes do well in music, mostly. If you look here, the whole note is at the top of the chart. And generally, a whole note gets 4 beats. Not always, because kind of a misconception about whole notes is that they always last for 4 beats. They don't. What they actually do is take up the whole measure. So in some cases, you might want to put a whole note in a measure. It actually is not 4 beats. But for our purposes, we're going to consider that the whole note is 4 beats long in duration. Once you take that note and you divide it in half, then you come up with 2 half notes. One of the confusing things about half notes is the name of it, half note. People will say, okay, it's a half note. It gets a half of a beat. No, it gets half of the duration of a whole note. So that means it actually is getting 2 beats, or it's lasting for 2 beats. So that term half sometimes gets people kind of confused. So if I have a whole note and it's lasting for 4 beats, I'm going to be singing these rhythms here just a little bit, so you'll have to bear with me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my voice last as long as that note should. A whole note would last for, I'm going to say whole as I do it. Whole. And if you hear, I'm going to pulse it again where you hear each one of those 4 pulses. Whole. Or you can say ta and listen to it, listen to the pulse of those 4 beats. Ta. If you then go to the half note, you have half of a whole note, which is 2 beats, and the other half of a whole note, which is 2 beats. So I'm going to sing what that sounds like for you as far as the duration of it. And it is 1, 2, ready, sing. It is ta, ta. I am using a pitch to do this. I don't have to use a pitch, but I think it just makes it more, makes sense that you hear that the note's lasting. So if I have a whole note, 2, ready, go. Ta, ta, ta. We're through the whole note and the half note. Now, there are different ways to do this with syllables, and those are called mnemonic rhythmic counting systems. One of the simplest ways to do is sort of what I'm doing now, which is the Kodai system, which uses just different syllables to help indicate how long the notes are sounding. We're going to look at that a little bit later. I'll talk about some systems for doing this. Some people on the half note sing 2 to remind them that it is 2 beats long. 2, 2. That is sometimes helpful. Okay, so if you take the the half note and then you divide the half note in half, then you're going to get two equal sounds. Those two sounds are called quarter notes. And again, the terminology can be confusing. It does not get a quarter of a beat. It gets a quarter of a whole note. So we have a whole note worth 4 beats or 4 counts, a half note worth 2, and now we have a quarter note which is worth 4 beats. A quarter note which is worth 1 beat. You will see how all of these are going to add up. Each time I go through a different type of a note, it's going to add up to 4 because they're putting it relative to the 4 beats. Okay, so when you have a quarter note, that means there is one sound on 1 beat. It would be like this. Ready, sing. Ta, 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 ta. In the Kodai system, ta is the way that it is generally portrayed. One sound, ta, on 1 beat. Okay, so if I start out with, I'm going to go through each one of these each time. I'm going to do whole note, half note, and then quarter notes. And I'm going to do it as it is written here, the whole note, 2 half notes, and 4 quarter notes. So they all equal the same. 1, 2, ready, sing. It is 2, 2, 2, ta, 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 ta. That takes us up to quarter note. If I take the quarter note and I divide it into 2 equal sounds, I come up with 2 eighth notes. And an eighth note ends up being a half of a beat, because if a quarter note equals 1 beat, then an eighth note is 1/2 of 1 beat. Now, the way that Kodai uses the terminology to I guess the word is portray. It's not really portray, but to voice or vocalize the rhythm is by saying ti-ti. And you're having 2 equal sounds over the duration of 1 beat. If I have quarter notes that are ta, 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 then eighth notes are ti, 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 ti. Again, quarter notes are 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ti. If you are tapping your foot with your heel on the floor and your toes doing the tapping, so to speak, what the quarter note would be when your toes or the front part of your foot goes down to the floor, and the TT is when the foot comes up in the air. That's why it's called an upbeat sometimes. That's not why, but it is called an upbeat. So if you're tapping your foot, put your heel down on the floor, and you're tap, 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 tap. Each one of those is a quarter note beat. So ta, 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 ta. It is tap, 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 ti, 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 ti. So the eighth note gets a half of a beat. If I take an eighth note and I divide an eighth note into 2 beats, 2 equal sounds, I should say, not to 2 beats, 2 equal sounds, then I get 2 16th notes. By the way, I'm going to come back and look at the stems here, but if you notice, the whole note has no stem, the half note has 1 stem, and the ball of the note is still not filled in. The quarter note has 1 stem, and the ball of the note is completely filled in. The eighth note has a stem with a flag, and the 16th note has a stem with 2 flags on it. So if I take the eighth note and I divide it into 2 equal sounds, that gives me 2 16th notes. Now, does a 16th note get a 16th of a beat? No, it does not. A 16th note gets a quarter of a beat. So it takes 4 16th notes, like this. These 4 16th notes equal 2 eighth notes equals 1 quarter note, and then 2 quarter notes equal a half note, and 2 half notes equal a whole note. I hope I did that right. Yeah, I didn't go through the whole thing. If you're going through the whole line, then you will see that I'm just going to do opposite here. There's the whole note. 2 half notes equal whole note. 4 quarter notes equal the whole note. Takes 4 because that's 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 eighth notes equal the whole note. And 16, I'm not going through counting those, but 16 16th notes equals the whole note. Okay, so that's kind of the duration. There are going to be a couple of assignments where you have to figure out the duration. You have to know that it takes 2 half notes to equal a whole note, or it takes 2 eighth notes to equal the quarter note, etc. In some cases, however, when we get to meter signature, a quarter note does not always get 1 beat, and things change around. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for our beginning studies, we're talking about usually that the quarter note is getting 1 beat. Therefore, the whole note's getting 4 beats. Okay, the next concept is that a dot after a note adds half of the value of the note back to that note. So if you have a note with a dot, you're going to, first of all, have to know how many beats that first note is worth. And then you have to add half of the value of that note back to it. If you look at the first example here, I'm going to change colors here to make it a little better. If you look at the first example, first thing you have to do is always be aware of the treble clef or bass clef or whatever clef it happens to be, what clef you're in, because it's going to be very important a little bit later. And then you're going to, especially with rhythmic exercises, you're going to want to look at the meter signature, and that's coming up in a minute, but there's that meter signature. And what happens with the meter signature is that the bottom note is a 4. If the bottom note is a 4, that means that a quarter note is getting 1 beat, what we just talked about. And then the top note, in this example, the 6, means how many of those 1 beat quarter notes is going to be in the measure. So I'm looking at, first of all, treble clef. It's not going to be important because all we're doing is rhythm right now, but it will be later. And then it's 6/4 meter, or 6/4 time. 6 beats in a measure, and a quarter note gets 1 beat. Look at the whole note. If a quarter note gets 1 beat, then a whole note is getting 4 beats. So the way I figure out how long the duration of that dotted whole note is going to be is that the dot will add 2 beats back to the whole note. Therefore, it's going to make it worth 6 beats. Now, if I visually look at what that is doing, there's the whole note, and there is half of the whole note, which is 2 beats, which is the half note. So I'm adding the 4 beats plus the 2 beats to equal 6 beats for the dotted whole note. There is an exercise here where you're going to have to kind of break down the notes. Let's look at the second example here. Treble clef, 3/4 time. 3 beats in a measure. And again, if 4 is on the bottom, kind of off there, if 4 is on the bottom, then a quarter note is getting 1 beat. Okay, so I look at the basic note, which is the half note, and I will know, either I'll have it memorized or I will look it up on a chart or something, and I will know that a half note equals 2 beats. And here is the half note over here. So if the half note equals 2 beats. Then half of 2 is 1 beat, and a quarter note is 1 beat. So I'm adding 1 beat or a quarter note back to the half note for the total of 3 beats. So the dotted half note equals 3 beats. Again, all this is just very mathematical. Not really hard to understand, even if you don't know anything about music. Okay, next example, 2/4 time in treble clef, 2 beats to a measure. And again, the 4 is on the bottom, so the quarter note is getting 1 beat. So this time I have the quarter note, and I have to add half of the value of the quarter note back to it. So here's the quarter note. It's worth 1 beat. Half of 1 is a half. And the note that gets a half of a beat is an eighth note. So here are the two. There's 2 eighth notes here. And what I actually want to do here on my music program, if you had a little bit of experience there with note flight, sometimes it tries to sync for you. Actually, let me make this black. I don't want that one there. Sorry. It wouldn't let me put that. Okay, so I'm crossing that one out. Sorry. So it's adding the eighth note, which is a half of a beat, back to the quarter note. Thus, it is giving the dotted quarter note how many beats. So far, we have been dealing with whole numbers, but in this case, if we have a quarter note and half of 1 beat, we have 1 1/2 beats, 1 1/2 beats. So that's a little bit different than we just did. So the dotted quarter is worth 1 1/2 beats. Now, traditionally, beginners in music have more trouble counting a dotted quarter note because it is 1 1/2 beats. I don't think in the first exercises that you have to do that, but just be aware it's 1 1/2 beats. Okay. Any questions on the dot? Okay, going on to stems, flags, and beams. This is the visual part of the notation of the rhythm that lets you know what kind of a note it is, or partially it does. And if you look at these, a half note has, again, 1 stem and the ball of the note is open. 1 stem, the ball of the note is open. That's for a half note. Now, stems are placed on the note if the note is below the 3rd line or the middle line, this line right here, the middle line of the staff. If it's below the middle line, then the stem goes up and to the right of the note. So I'm going to say that again. If the note is below the midpoint of the staff, the middle line, like this note is, then the stem goes up and to the right of the note. If the note is above the 3rd line or the midline of the staff, if it's above it, then the stem goes down and on the left side of the note. If the note is on the midpoint of the staff, it can go upward or downward. Usually it goes down, but it could go upward. I didn't draw that very well, but you can tell. Eighth notes, the direction of the stem doesn't change. The direction of the stem is always the same, whether it's below the 3rd line or above the 3rd line. So if you look over here at this 8th note, the 8th note stem is going upward because the note's below the 3rd line. And to indicate that this note is an 8th note, it needs one flag on it. That's what an eighth note has, is one flag. This one, the stem is going down and to the left, and it still has the one flag, so that's an eighth note. A 16th note, on the other hand, has two flags to indicate that it is a 16th note. So those are 16th notes. And I don't have one here, but a whole note has no stem, and it's usually open in the middle. There's another note called a double whole note that has a line on either side of it. It's very rarely used, but I believe it does have that in your book. Okay, so another way, if you have flags on notes, if you have 8th notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, etc., another way to indicate the rhythm is to beam the note. So instead of putting a flag here on this note and here on this note, instead of doing that, I put one beam across there. It's still like one flag because it's one beam. It's the same as the flag. But it's to group those two notes together. And the more you get proficient at reading music, a lot of the time when there are groupings or groups of 2 or 4 eighth notes, 16th notes, they are beamed instead of the flag being on there. It just is busier looking with the flags on there. You could, if you wanted to, it would not be incorrect to write this rhythm here of this eighth note and this eighth note. It would not be incorrect to put a stem with one flag on it and separate them. You can see that the beams, if the notes are below like this, the beam is going up on the top. And really, the rule on this is for kind of what seems to be the best. If I have this note, whoops, I don't want to do that one. If I have this note, which is higher up on the staff, and this note, it makes more sense to beam it on the bottom probably because there's space in between the two staffs if it's a grand staff than it does on the top. But it is possible and not incorrect if I took it and I beamed it this way. That would not be incorrect either. Looking over here at 16th notes, 16th notes have two beams across the top. Just like the two flags, it has two beams. And a lot of times, 16th notes are in groups of 4s. You can imagine that they would be because it takes 4 of them to equal 1 beat. So they're in groups of 4s, and you can beam them accordingly. They don't have to be in groups of 4s. They can be in 2s or 3s or whatever. But that's stems, flags, and beams. Next thing, ties and slurs. Commonly confused, even though they're very different and they do very different things. A tie is a way to indicate that a note lasts longer than what is there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You are tying notes together to equal a certain amount of beats. And there are certain reasons to do this. The main reason to do this is to indicate a tied note over a bar line when you want to have one note. When you want to have one note on that side of the bar line and one note on that side of the bar line, which we're not going to do right now. And you want that to be one sound that does not have a break in it, then you tie that note that's over on this side to the note that's over on this side. So that's the main reason you do that. But looking at the example, this is 6/4 time, and say I want a note to last for 6 beats. So I take the first note and then I tie that note to the next note, and then I tie it to the next note. And what that does, it ties all those beats together. So 2 beats plus 2 beats plus 2 beats equals 6 beats. If I'm playing or singing that, that means I have 6 beats of continuous sound with no break in it, not 3 groups of 2 beats. So if I'm singing that, and here's my pulse, 1, 2, 3, 1, ready, go, it will be ta for 6 beats, no break in it. That's what a tied note does. Now, a tie note has to do with the rhythm of the note. Ties always have to do with the rhythm. You're tying beats together. A slur, on the other hand, is a different character. And the slur over here is from one note or one pitch to a different pitch. You'll see that in treble clef, that's from a C to an E. You will see the slur marking up at the top here. Just going to kind of go over it in a different color. Well, I thought I was going to go over it in a different color. Right there. Okay, so you see the slur marking there in the original. It's in red. And what slurs have to do with is the articulation of the sound. And that, in layman's terms, just means actually the smoothness. So you are going to go from one note to the next note in a smooth manner, smooth as you can, without breaks in that note. So if I'm singing from the C to the E, I'm not going to make a break in it. If I'm playing an instrument, I'm not going to do what is tonguing. A lot of you have played instruments in band, so I'm not going to tongue that or press my tongue to the mouthpiece so it stops the sound as I'm doing that. It's going to be one continuous smooth sound. So that would be, if this is a C, which I'm going to do a low C, this is a C, I'm going to sing it from C, rather than C, E. Again, the slur means smooth and connected. C, that's ties and slurs. Something that you may or may not run across. I think actually in a couple of the, not slurs you won't, but in a couple of the examples you might have a note that is tied across the bar a little bit later on in the lessons. Okay, if we have notes to indicate sounds, then we must have something that indicates silence. And the rest is what indicates silence in musical notation. It's a resting place. It's where there is no sound. So every value of note has a coordinating value of a rest. And we're going to take a look at this chart here. I'm going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you look over here, here is the whole, whoops, I don't want to do that one. If you see the whole note here, 4 beats, that's what we're saying it is anyway, then the whole rest is indicated by that rectangular black bar, which hangs down from the 4th line of the staff. When I say 4th line, I always count the lines from the bottom of the staff. So it hangs down from the 4th line of the staff. That indicates 4 beats of silence. The half note has a corresponding rest of a half rest. The half rest is the same shape as the whole rest. It's a black rectangle, but it is indicated by placing it on top of the 3rd line of the staff. Now, the way I teach children to remember is that the whole note is heavier. It fell down off of the top of that line because it was so heavy, so it was worth 4. And the half rest looks like a hat. If you just kind of use your imagine there, it looks like a hat, so half and hat. And again, to the trained eye, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. If your eye is not trained, then you may have to kind of really get in there and look to see where it's either hanging or sitting on top of the line. Okay, then the quarter note has a corresponding rest, the quarter rest. And that's what it looks like. When you draw it yourself, if you ever have to draw it yourself, you don't have to really put down the thin part and then the thick part. You kind of just make a squiggly looking, almost like a, I kind of consider it to be like an E sort of, but anyway, that's the quarter rest. That indicates 1 beat of silence. Eighth notes, 1/8 note, like that, is a half a beat. And here's the 8th note rest. You'll notice that it has one of the little flag-like things on there. I don't actually, truthfully, I don't really know what you call those. It has one, just like the 8th note itself has one flag. The 8th rest has the one flag-like thing. I guess I should look that up. A 16th note with 2 flags. The 16th rest has the 2 indications on it. And we didn't do 32nd notes before, but 32nd notes have 3 flags, and they also would have 3 indicators on the rest. So for every rest, there is a note or a sound, and for every sound, there's an indication for silence. Going on to meter signatures. Meter signatures are very, very important. They help you to figure out how the feeling of the rhythm or how the beats are grouped, which gives you a certain feel for the piece of music. It's also called a time signature sometimes. I usually say meter signature because it is in the meter. It's how the beats are grouped, going in meter, or the metering of the piece of music. So I usually say meter signature, but you can say time signature. We talked about this just a little bit prior. The meter signature has a top note and a bottom note. The top note indicates how many beats are in one measure, and the bottom note indicates what type of a note is getting 1 beat. This meter signature is 2/4, which means there are 2 beats in a measure and a quarter note is getting 1 beat. If there are 2 beats in a measure, then you can fill in that measure, or the bar, another word for measure is bar. You can fill it in with any equal equivalent that you want to, going back to how many quarter notes, half notes, whole notes, etc. equal each other. Then you can fill this in. As I said before, if you worked with Note Flight on assignment 2.2, I believe it is, then sometimes the program wants to fill it in for you and make it come out correct to however many beats are supposed to be there. In this example, 2/4 time, if you look up here on this measure, then there are 2 quarter notes. Does that make sense? Yes. A quarter note is 1 beat, so there are 2 of them in that measure. That means there are 2 beats in that measure. So that is a correct measure. Looking at this measure over here, there are 8 16th notes in that measure. Does that make it a complete and whole measure? Yes, it does. Because if you remember back to the equivalence, it takes 4 16th notes to equal 1 beat. So there's 4 16th notes. That's 1 beat right here. and then four more, whoops, that wasn't a very good drawing. Four more 16th notes. That equals another beat. So all in all, there are 2 beats in that measure. There are 8 notes, but only 2 beats. Each note is not a beat. Novices in music sometimes think, okay, a note is a beat, but it's not. So it takes 8 of those notes to actually equal 2 beats and make that complete measure. If I go down here to this measure, then I have eighth notes. Eighth notes are worth 1/2 of 1 beat. So here's a half of a beat, 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 to equal 2 beats. So that is a correctly written measure. It has 2 beats in it. And then in the last measure here, for an example, there is a half note, and a half note equals 2 beats. So all you have to put in that measure is 1 half note to make it a complete measure. Now there are, in the assignments, which I'm going to go through, there are exercises where you have to know what the measure is lacking or what you need to add to that measure. Okay, we just did the meter signature that uses 4 on the bottom. A quarter note getting 1 beat. There are others that do not have a 4 on the bottom. One of the most common is to have an 8 on the bottom. And if it has an 8 on the bottom, it means that an 8th note is getting 1 beat. Whoops, it doesn't get 1 beta. It actually gets 1 beat. Let me switch that here. Sorry. This sometimes is a hard concept for people to understand, even for musicians, because you're switching the relative of what you're using here, the relative part of what you're using. We usually use that quarter note and the whole note, and the quarter note is getting 1 beat, but now we switch it all around. If it has 8 on the bottom, then the 8th note is getting 1 beat. So look at this meter signature. 3 beats in a measure, and an 8th note gets 1 beat. Previously, if I had 3 beats in a measure and a quarter note, I would need to put 3 quarter notes. But not now, because now an 8th note is getting 1 beat. Here's an 8th note, here's 2 8th notes, and here's 3 8th notes. Is that a complete measure if the meter is 3/8? Yes, it is, because that's 3 beats if an 8th note gets 1 beat. Going to equivalence, look at this next measure. There is a quarter note. A quarter note, if an 8th note is getting 1 beat, how many beats does a quarter note get here? Michael, are you awake? You want to answer? Or have you fallen asleep? So if a quarter note is getting 1 beat, if an 8th note is getting 1 beat, then a quarter note is getting 2 beats. So that's worth 2 beats. The next note is an 8th note. It's 1 beat. So 2 beats plus 1 beat is 3 beats in that measure. Is that correct? Yes, it is. There are 3 beats in that measure. Here is another equivalent. This is a dotted quarter note in 3/8 time. How many 8th notes are inside of a quarter note? There are 2 8th notes inside of a quarter note. It takes 2 8th notes to make a quarter note. And then that half of a beat of that is another 8th note. So this note in this meter signature, the dotted quarter in 3/8 time, gets 3 beats. In 3/4 time, it got 1.5 beats. Now, I don't want to get you too confused on this, but it gets 3 beats, so that is a correct measure. Look at this measure. 3/8 time, 1 beat, 2 beats. There is an eighth note rest. So that measure equals 3 beats. Look at the next measure. Eighth note, 1 beat, eighth rest, 2 beats, eighth rest, 3 beats. It is a correct measure. And the last example measure here has 3 beats of silence. But there are still 3 beats in that measure. Whether they are silent or not, they will still be in there. There are lots of meter signatures, some more unusual than others. Usually, we do not use too much the meter signature that uses 1 beat in a measure, but it is possible that we do. Put it over here, 1 beat in a measure. You could have 1 time, 1 2 time. If you look over here, it kind of lists some of those. Those are very unusual. 2 beats per measure is very common. You could have, for example, 2 2 time, where 2 beats in a measure, a half note gets a beat. 2 beats in a measure, a quarter note gets a beat. 2 beats in a measure, an eighth note gets a beat. 2 beats in a measure, a 16th note gets a beat. On and on, on and on. The one that I did not go through right here, which is pretty common, is when there is a meter signature of 3/4. Excuse me, a meter signature that has 2 on the bottom for a half note. I'm just going to write one right here. 4/2 time, or 4/2 meter, would be 4 beats in a measure, and a half note gets 1 beat. It's pretty common to have the 2 on the bottom where the half note is actually getting 1 beat. There's a bunch of them over here where a half note gets 1 beat. The most common are 2 on the bottom, a half note gets 1 beat, 4 on the bottom, a quarter note gets 1 beat, and 8 on the bottom, an eighth note gets 1 beat. That's the 3 most common. Also, 16 on the bottom is pretty common also. So these are all different kinds of meters. If you wanted to look at mixed meter, one piece of music doesn't have to have just 1 meter. It can be mixed meter. It can be changing. This is just an example of the notation from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, written in 1913. It's famous for its savage rhythms. This music actually caused a riot the first time it was ever played. But you will see in this that there are many different meters here. 3/16, and then the very next measure is 5/16, back to 3/16, 4/16, and back to 5/16. So all different things there, all different meters, all different numbers of beats with a 16th note getting 1 beat. So there are unusual meter signatures. Okay, those are the basics of the notation for rhythm. And I'm going to go through some of these assignments now. Assignment 3.1 and 2, 3.1 and 3.2, you do not submit, but I want you to be aware of how to do these. So I want to look at them at least. Anytime there's an assignment that it says do not submit, you should look at it just to see what information is in there. The directions say divide the first note in each measure into the correct number of smaller notes indicated. So you have 4/4 time and a whole note there. So a quarter note is getting 1 beat. There's a whole note. A whole note equals 4 beats in 4/4 meter signature. So there's 4 beats. How am I going to put the equivalent of 4 beats in a measure using an eighth note? mathematically, it's pretty simple to figure out if you go back to that chart. A whole note is 4 beats, and an eighth note is a half of a beat. So how many of those eighth notes is it going to take to equal the whole note? These are not very good. And they're not filled in, but they should be if I was writing a correct eighth note. Let's see if I have this correct. Just bear with me here while I fix these eighth notes here in my archaic way. It would be nice if WIMBA had notes on here to use, but since they don't, I make the best I can of it. And we'll say that, I don't know, maybe I can kind of, I'll see if I can kind of fill those in. Whoa, a little bit too much. Anyway, you get the idea. They should be filled in. And then I'm going to beam these. Well, I'm not going to beam them with that. Sorry, let me go back to this. Now I'm going to beam them. Wow, I guess I'm going to beam them with that color. That's all right. We'll just be colorful today. Okay, so if I have an eighth note equaling a half of a beat, and again, those should be all filled in, but actually you can tell by the beam that it's an eighth note. Okay, an eighth note's a half of a beat. A half and a half is 1 beat. A half and a half added to it's 2 beats. A half and a half, 3 beats. A half and a half, 4 beats. So if I divide the first note into the correct number of smaller notes indicated, I would be dividing it into 8 eighth notes. That's what that assignment does. I guess I could have looked here. That's a much better way. I forgot I put this on here like this. So there's the whole note, and there's the eighth notes. Now those eighth notes have different pitches. That's okay. It just means that now we have rhythm plus melody. But there's the whole note, and there's the equivalent 8 eighth notes. 3.2. Give a simplified notation for the rhythms below, substituting one note with a dot if necessary for each set of tied notes. There's another assignment that you do that says give one note, and some people do not read that instruction. Habitually, they do not read that. Give a simplified notation, substituting one note with a dot if necessary for each set of tied notes. So we said the notes tied together have a certain note value or a certain duration. So if I'm looking here at this first measure, and it's 2/4 meter, 2 beats in a measure, and a quarter note gets 1 beat, then here are 2 eighth notes tied together. An eighth note is a half of a beat, so that's a half of a beat tied to a half of a beat. That equals what in 2/4 time? A half of a beat plus a half of a beat is 1 beat. It said only use the ones that are tied. So this is what you would put. One note that equals what is over here is the quarter note. The next example is 4/4 time, 4 beats in a measure. A quarter note gets 1 beat. It's a quarter note tied to a dotted half note. Quarter note tied to a dotted half note. Adding those beats together, it makes it one continuous sound when it's tied. A quarter note in 4/4 time is 1 beat. A dotted half note in 4/4 time is 3 beats. So that is 1 beat plus 3 beats equals 4 beats. The one note right here, the whole note, well, equals those two tied notes, and it's one note that equals it. So that's what those assignments do. So you know how to do the equivalence. 3.3 is one that you will turn in. And in 3.3, you are going to be placing the correct bar lines, or call the measure line, in each rhythmic exercise. I gave you one here that's not in the 4/4 time. To use as an example, this is 6/8 time. Remembering back, the top number always means how many beats are in a measure, and the bottom number means what kind of a note is getting one beat. So this is 6 beats in a measure, and an eighth note gets 1 beat. Okay, so I have to know like the equivalence of eighth notes, quarter notes, and all of that, and how I'm going to do that. And I'm going to put 6 beats in every measure. Let's look at this. Okay, these are 3. Well, I don't want to use that one. Sorry. Let me switch this arrow. These are 3 eighth notes. The reason I know they're eighth notes is it has that one beam there. They're beamed together, 3 of them. So that's 3 beats. If I put a bar line or a measure line right here, would that be correct? No, because there would only be 3 beats in that measure. So I have to keep going. There's 3 beats. The next note is a quarter note. There are 2 eighth notes inside of a quarter note. 2 eighth notes equal the quarter note. So that's 2 more beats. And then there's one, that's for a total of 5. And then there's one more eighth note there, and that's 6. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the quarter, 6 beats. So where do I need to put the measure line? Right there. That will give me 6 beats in the measure. Going on. In 6/8 time, with an eighth note getting 1 beat, a dotted quarter gets 3 beats. There's another dotted quarter, 3 beats. So the dotted quarter for 3 beats plus another dotted quarter for 3 beats equals 6 beats. And I need to put another measure line right there. Going on. I'm going to move up here just a little bit to get, actually I'll move down. An eighth note is 1 beat. Remember, this is a 6/8 time where an eighth note is getting 1 beat. A quarter note is 2 beats. That's 3. 8, 4, 8, 5, 8, 6, and a measure line goes right here. Now that next one is really complicated. It's not at all. It's very easy to figure it out if you know the equivalence. There's 1 quarter note, that's 1 beat. Now it takes 2 16th notes to equal an eighth note. So it's 2 16th notes equal 1 beat. So there's the eighth note, and then 2 16ths, that's 1 beat. 2 more 16ths, 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 1 beat, for a total of 6 beats, and then the measure line would go right there at the end. So that's in 6/8 time, putting the correct bar lines. Okay, let's look at this next example. Place correct bar lines or measure lines in each rhythmic exercise. Look at the meter signature. It's in 3/4 time. We're back to a quarter note gets one beat. 3 beats in a measure and a quarter note gets one beat. This will be very simple for you to do. Quarter note, 1 beat. Quarter note, 1 beat. And 2/8 notes are 1 beat. We need 3 beats in every measure. So here's the measure line. 2/8 notes. I guess I should put it for 2. Well, I'm not going to put it there because I'm kind of putting the arrows as 1 beat. So 2/8 notes is 1 beat. 2/8 notes is 1 beat. And 4/16 notes is 1 beat for a total of 3 beats. We remember we need 3 beats in each measure. It's kind of hard for me to put that in there, but there's the bar line. Okay. Then we have a dotted half note. How many beats does a dotted half note get in 3/4 time? If a quarter note gets 1 beat, how many beats does a dotted half note get? 2 beats. Half note gets 2, plus half of that's 1. So that one note gets 3 beats. So it would be worth 3 beats. And then we need a measure line. Whoops. Right there. Well, okay. Not cooperating. Let's try that one more time. 3rd time's the charm. A measure line right there. And then look at the last one. Usually I wouldn't leave it so that it wouldn't be even, but a half note's 2 beats. In 3/4 time it is, and a quarter note's 1 beat for a total of 3 beats, and there is a measure line already there. I'll just put it in black. Well, maybe I won't put it in black. So being very cooperative. Now, okay. So that's another example of putting correct measure lines in the examples, and you have to do that in one of the examples there. Now that particularly 3.3 is submitted using the CD-ROM. If you have a problem with the CD-ROM, you should call me, and not call me, but email me and let me tell you something else to do. But you have to have all the measure lines correct to get credit for that particular line. Then another thing on 3.3 is to add a correct meter signature to each measure. And in this, there are different meters that will work depending on how you're thinking, and I'm going to kind of show you how this works. Many of these will have more than one meter signature, which could be correct. Since we don't know if a quarter note's getting a beat or a half note's getting a beat, or an eighth note's getting 1 beat on these, since it doesn't tell us, then we kind of have to use our math skills in figuring this out. Now, we don't want to work in halves, so we're going to throw that out right away. No half beats in the meter signature. So let's just look at a couple of these. I'm going to show you how this goes. Okay, right away, if I look at this example, I look at this note, I'm thinking, okay, there's a quarter note and a half note here. It would make sense that I would be using something, some meter signature that has a 4 on the bottom, so that a quarter note is getting a beat. So if I want to use a quarter note getting a beat, that would be well and good. I think that will work. Let's see if it will work. If a quarter note gets 1 beat, then a half note gets 2 beats, and the quarter note gets 1. So 2 plus 1 is 3 beats if a quarter note gets 4 beats. So if I put a meter signature of 3/4 time, that would be correct. 3 beats to a measure, and a quarter note gets 1 beat. what if I'm not thinking that way? What if I think, oh, well, see, I want to put an eighth note getting one beat. Will that work? Yes, it will. So I'm going to use an eighth note on the bottom. If an eighth note gets one beat, then how many beats would be in that measure? I have to count up all the eighth notes that would be within the half note and the quarter note there. If an eighth note is getting one beat, so let's start with the half note. If an eighth note gets one beat, a quarter note would get two beats, and a half note would get four beats. So the half note gets four beats, the quarter note gets two beats. So 4 beats plus 2 beats, if an eighth note is getting one beat, would be, whoops. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, four beats plus 2 beats. If an eighth note is getting one beat, would be 6 beats of eighth note. So it's 6/8 time. That's if an eighth note's getting a beat. Remember, it wasn't that if we're considering that a quarter note's getting one beat. If a quarter note's getting one beat, then it's 3 beats of 4 of quarter notes. 3, 4 times. So that one has 2 that you could do. You could go ahead and go down. You could do 16ths too. You could work with 16ths. I wouldn't suggest doing that. I would use either half, quarter, or eighth notes. I think all of them would work with that. Okay, so let's look at the next example here. Here's a quarter note and another quarter note. If can I use a quarter note gets a beat? Well, sure. If there's 2 quarter notes in there, I can certainly say a quarter note's getting one beat. So I can use a quarter note on the bottom. And if a quarter note gets one beat and there's 2 quarter notes there, then what could I use? 2/4 time. 2/4 time works great for that. We can also do some other things with it. What if a half note gets one beat? If I decide to make it a half note on the bottom that gets one beat, could I do that? A quarter note and a quarter note equals 1 half note. So if I decided to make that 1/2 time, I could do that. Could I turn it into the meter of an eighth note getting a beat? I'm just showing you that there are several different answers that you can put here, and all of them would be correct since you're the one that's putting it in there. No one told you what to use. So if I want to use it as an eighth note getting one beat, how many eighth notes are inside of those 2 quarter notes? There would be 4. So that would be 4/8 time. Next one. Now this has, we'll just try a couple of things here. I can look at it and I can tell that a quarter note getting a beat is not going to work. How can I tell that? Because there's a half of a beat here. So I can't really do that. I can't make it into a quarter note because I told you I don't want to use halves. So how else could I indicate this meter signature? Well, I see the eighth note, and that's a half a beat, and so it would be a good idea that maybe we would be going in half beats. So if an eighth note is getting one beat, how many beats are in this measure? A quarter note equals 2 beats, and the eighth note is 1 if an eighth note is getting a beat, and that would be 3/8 time. Now you could go for a 16th time. I wouldn't do that, but 3/8 time works really well. Half with 2 on the bottom, a half note getting a beat, that wouldn't work because this is considered to be a complete measure, and there's not a half note worth of beats in there. So that one really has to be 3/8 time. Looking at another one here, down at this one. Well, there are a couple things I could do here, and I'm just going to tell you that you can use, let me just do them all down here. You can use a half note getting a beat for this one. You can use a quarter note getting a beat for this one. Or you could use an eighth note getting a beat for this one. Whoa, when did I do that? Let me try it again here. A half note getting a beat, a quarter note getting a beat, and an eighth note getting a beat. It's not working. I don't want to do that. Let's try it again. A half note getting a beat, a quarter note getting a beat, and an eighth note getting a beat. I see what's going. It's gone off the whiteboard there. That's what it is. So I hope you can read that. Half and a quarter and an eighth. So that's your bottom number. Okay, if a half note's getting one beat, and you see those two whole notes, how many beats of half notes would be in that measure? There would be 4. Half note, two half notes in the whole note, 2 times. So there would be 4 2 time. It would be 4 2 time. If I want to use quarter notes, if a quarter note gets one beat, how many beats would be in that measure? Well, whole notes, we know that there's 4 quarter notes in a whole note, so there's 2 whole notes, so 4 plus 4, that would be 8 4 time. How many beats of eighth notes would there be in there? Eighth note getting an eighth note's getting one beat. So how many beats of eighth notes would be in that measure? It would be 16 8 times, which is not common, but those are all correct. The next one, I'm kind of trying to mess you up a little bit, but we have unequal. When it's unequal, and you see those 2 eighth notes there, and you see that the quarter note's divided into 3s, usually a dotted quarter note, then you're pretty much going to think that we're going to use an eighth note gets one beat. Whoops, let me do that again. Let me put it up here. I'll put it up here on the side. That an eighth note gets one beat. Okay, if an eighth note gets one beat, a dotted quarter is getting 3, and then another eighth, 4, and another eighth would be 5 eighth notes. 5 beats of eighth notes in that measure for 5 8 time. Could I put a quarter note there on the bottom? No, because it wouldn't come out equal. Could I put a half note there? No, it wouldn't come out equal. So in that case, 5 8 time is the only one you could use. 3 4. Each measure is rhythmically incomplete, and I have to put the measure lines in this because, like I said before, that my music writing program thinks I'm dumb and won't allow me to make mistakes. So let me put these little measures in here right now. Okay, each measure is rhythmically incomplete. Complete each measure by adding one note of the proper value. Okay, look at the meter signature first of all. If you have not noticed in your book, the C indicates 4 4 time. It is called common time because it is the most common time. So the C there is common time. It is 4 4 time, and it is very common to see it displayed that way in the meter signature. 4 4 time. Okay, if you see a dotted half note, how many beats is that worth in 4 4 time? It is worth 3. So in order for me to put one note of the proper value, then I will have to put 1 quarter note there. I want to see if I can kind of fill that in, sort of. Okay, so that's supposed to be filled in black. So I put 1 note in, and that made it equal 4 beats in that measure. Look at the next measure. I want to put 1 note in, and then so that the measure will equal 4 beats. There's already 2 quarter notes there, so that takes up 2 beats. So what will I have to do? I'm going to use 1 note, and that note would have to equal 2 beats to make it 4 in the measure. So I'm putting a half note. The next measure is a half note. It's worth 2 beats. I want to put 1 note in that measure to make this a complete measure. Therefore, I will put another half note. Okay, so all of those measures are correct because in 4/4 time, each one of those measures has 4 beats in it. Look at the next one down here. 4/2 time. 2 beats in a measure. Excuse me, I said it wrong. 4 beats in a measure and a half note gets 1 beat. 4 beats in a measure, a half note gets 1 beat. And I'd have to put 1 note in every measure. How can I do that? Well, there's the whole note that's worth 2 beats. This is pretty simple. If I know the whole note's worth 2 beats, then I want to add another whole note for another 2 beats. So that's 4 beats right there. 4 beats of half notes. Each whole note has 2 half notes within it. Okay, I need 4 beats of half notes, and I need to put in 1 note. Here's 1 beat, 1 beat, and 2 beats on the whole note. So now that's a complete measure. Look at the next measure. I see three beats there, 3 beats of half notes, and I know that I need to put, that's really a lousy circle. Let me try a better one. A little bit better. I need to put 1 more note, the half note, which makes it a complete measure. That's what you're doing on 3.4. Okay. Count using the Eastman system. The Eastman system is a system that I recommend you use for when we're starting to do counting and understanding counting, because I believe it's the easiest one to use, especially if you don't already know one. If you already know another system, standard numeric, whatever, you may use it. I know them all, so I can figure it out. But if you do not know our counting system, please use the Eastman system, because there is a document there, a link to a document that explains it, and it's pretty easy to figure out the rhythms using it. Also, North Texas almost exclusively uses Eastman counting system for teaching band and orchestra students. Okay, so the rules that we're going to be working with today are these right here. The Eastman counting system is a set of syllables used to read rhythms. That's the mnemonic syllables used to read rhythms. This method can be used to study the rhythms of a written piece, accurately transcribe music, or to help you sight sing melodies. There are only 6 rules to master. Number 1, a note that begins on the beat is called by the number of the beat. So if a note starts on beat number 1, it's called 1. If it starts on beat number 2, it's called 2. If it starts on beat number 4, it's called 4. Rule number 2, note that begins halfway between 2 beats is called te, the syllable te. So a note that is halfway between 2 beats is called te. Number 3, a note that begins on the second quarter of the beat is called ti. And really, those are the only ones that we're going to use today. Number 4 is a note that begins on the second third of the beat is la. A note that begins on the third third of a beat is li. And any other note is called ta. So that may not make any sense to you, but once you apply the rules, it should help. Okay, so let's just use that system. Here's an example. 3/4 time, a quarter note gets 1 beat, and there is a dotted half note. It lasts for 3 beats. One thing that I want you to do in this when you are counting is when you have a note that has a continued sound, a continuation of the initial attack of the note. This note begins on beat 1. It's at the beginning of the measure. It's right after the meter signature. I know that it begins on beat 1. So that's the rule. A note that begins on the beat is called the number of that beat. So I'm counting that, saying 1. Now, if I say 1, that only lets it last for 1 beat. That note lasts for 3 beats. So what I want to do is to show that the sound is continuing on for another 2 beats without putting space in between it. So I'm going to put a dash and another dash to indicate that there are 3 beats there. But the attack or the initial sound starts on beat 1. So if I'm counting that, it's going to sound like 1, ready, count. 1. It's one sound that lasts for 3 beats. But I showed that it started on beat 1 and it continued for the next 2 beats for a total of 3. Okay, let's look at the next note, this note right here. It begins on which beat of the measure? It begins on beat 1 of the measure. It lasts for 2 beats and they're continued, so I'm going to put the dash. So if it starts on beat 1, it lasts for 2 beats, that takes up the first 2 beats of the measure. Then the next quarter note starts on beat 3, or the attack of the sounds on beat 3. So that measure is 1, 3. Look at the next measure, 3 quarter notes. First one starts on beat 1. If it starts on beat 1 and then there's another quarter note which equals 1 beat, it must start on beat 2, and another one starts on beat 3. 1, 2, 3. Next one, there's the half note again with the quarter note, and I've already done it once, so I know that it's 2 beats. 1, and then the last beat. Now, until you get used to doing this, you can use the kodai, which uses those other syllables. So if you use tas and twos, and if it equals 3 beats, you can say 3. And if you get a pulse going and use the pulse and use just those syllables, I could kind of figure it out. 1, ready, go. 3, 2, ta, 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 ta. 2, ta. I can also just say ta on all of them and continue it out. Ta, 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 ta. When I use the numbers in the Eastman system, it sounds exactly the same, but I'm using the syllables of the Eastman. 1, 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. One example. Okay, this is 4/4 time. The first note begins on beat number 1. It is a dotted half. I know it lasts for 3 beats because a quarter note's getting a beat in 4/4 time. And then there's another quarter note. So that is the initial attack is on beat number 1. Lasts for 2 more beats to equal 3 beats, and then the last quarter note occurs on beat number 4. Next measure, beat number 1, quarter note's on it. It gets 1 beat, remember. Beat number 2, beat number 3, and beat number 4. There's a quarter note on each one of those beats. Next measure starts on beat number 1. If that's on beat number 1, it takes up beat number 1, then the half note has to begin on number 2, beat number 2, and it lasts for 2 beats. Then the last quarter note has to begin on beat number 4. Last measure, half note, starts on beat number 1, lasts for 2 beats. If it lasts for 2 beats, beats 1 and 2 are taken up, and then the next note has to start, next half note starts on beat number 3 and takes up 2 beats. Now, if I just do this using tas, if I say ta and make it last the right number of beats, it would sound like this. 1, ready, go. 1, sorry, I'm doing it wrong. I just want to use tas first. Ta. Trying to think here. Okay, ta. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, 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 ta. If I count it using numbers, then it's going to sound 1, 2, ready, count. 1, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3. .1. I don't think you have to do any of these, but a note that begins halfway between 2 beats is called te in the Eastman system. This really has to do with eighth notes. It takes 2 eighth notes to equal 1 quarter note. So that's 2 equal sounds on the quarter note. So if you have eighth notes, 2 eighth notes grouped together, the second one of those is the second half of the beat. So in that system, the second half of the beat is called te. So I know that I'm going to use te to count that right off the bat. There's a second half of it. That's the second half of the beat right there. I'm not going to write these in, but I'm going to count them for you. This is 4/4 time. 1, 2, ready, count. 1, 2, te, 3, 4. 1, te, 2, 3. 1, 1, 4 te. These are all practice countings. You can try to figure out what they are. Then I'm going to count them for you. Here's line number 1. It is 2/4 time. That means 2 beats in a measure. A quarter note gets 1 beat. So I'm starting right here. That starts on 1. Okay, I'm going to count this line for you. 1, 2, ready, count. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. I wonder if I can make the arrow go at the same time that I count. Probably not. I'm just going to experiment and try it and see if I can do that. 1, 2, ready, count. 1, 2, 1. 1, 2, 1. 1, 2. That worked pretty well, I guess. Next one is 3 beats in a measure. A quarter note gets 1 beat. 1, ready, count. 1, 2, 1, 1, 3, 1, 2, rest. Now, there's a rest in here, and whenever you have a rest, which you will have later on, you indicate that by just putting an R. That's what that beat of silence is. Next one, 4/4 time, common time. 4 beats in a measure. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, count. 1, 2, 4, 1, 4, 1, rest, rest. 1, 2, 3, 4, rest, 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 rest. And I can't do those as I'm counting here, but I'm going to put an R right there. Whoops. and R right there. Well, or not. And then in the last measure, I should have 4 beats of rest. That concludes our lesson. Thank you very much.